welcome to another Software Snacktime Snippet presented by XTIVIA. This is the third and final part of our series on IBM Audits, myths, pitfalls, tips, and tricks. And so far in the series, we've been talking a lot about the myths and pitfalls, common questions that come up during audits. And now we'll really get into the audit process and talk about how to handle it if you have to face an IBM audit. And today we are joined by the director at ITAA Management. And today we're joined by the director at ITAA and a former IBM Audit employee, Koen Dingjan. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Koen to talk about the audit process.
Right. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Alex. So I'll talk a little bit first about the process itself, and then I'll talk about kind of tips and tricks in each phase of the audit. Because no matter in what phase of the audit you're in, there's always things you can do to improve the outcome. But of course, the earlier you start with taking the right steps, the better the outcome will be. So at a high level, the audit starts when you receive a notification letter from IBM. There can be different forms. There can be a formal letter. Sometimes it's an email. But this communication will come from IBM, and they'll announce an audit, which they call a review. And it's almost always performed by, so those are the standard parties IBM works with. And they'll ask for a kickoff meeting. So this kickoff meeting will be a three-way call in which IBM will talk about the audit process, and then ask KPMG or Deloitte to talk about the specifics. And then you as a customer will be asked to talk about your organization, or and perhaps also some details about timelines. I'll talk a little bit later about what things to consider in this stage. Then they'll proceed to data gathering. So after the kickoff is done, it will be a one-on-one exercise between the auditor and you as a customer. So IBM will step away during that period, and the auditor will provide information requests. And once all the data is gathered, they'll ask for certain analysis and validation testing to make sure that the data set they collected is complete and accurate. Then the final stages, which are very important, are the reporting phase. So that's when the auditor shows their technical findings. And once the report has been confirmed, or at least that phase is completed, normally there are findings, unfortunately, in those audit reports. So then the settlement discussions will begin between IBM and you as a customer. So the typical throughput time is, it varies widely, but often we'll say it can be done in 3 months, but that's probably only the smallest organizations. For slightly larger organizations, I would count on at least 6 months, but even a year and a half. It can even be more than that, but usually there are specific reasons for delays like that. So I'll move on now to talk about the tips and tricks in each phase. So the most important, the most value you can get by, or the best way to optimize the outcome of the audits is to start as early as possible. So Amir talked before about preparing by doing an internal dry run. So that's always good. If you have the time available, is to actually do an internal compliance assessment to see where you stand, your compliance position. And this is probably the most important tip. Is the second one is to make sure that you fully meet the requirements for subcapacity licensing, because if you don't fully meet them yet, there are still things you can do before an audit to put yourself in better shape, and where you might then be assessed as having met the subcapacity requirements. I'll talk a little bit later about why that's so important, because of the significant risk that's involved in that. But that's probably the most important thing you can do aside from doing a dry run, is to make sure that you understand the subcapacity requirements and you meet them as much as possible. Now, when you get into the kickoff and scoping phase, it's very important that you keep in mind, that the audit process itself is negotiable. There's not one way to do an audit. There's many different sources that can be used or steps that can be taken. So it's important that you make sure that whatever audit process is performed, that it matches, your priorities as an organization. Also, the timeline. You might want to, start at a later date because of, availability of internal staff. The audit terms and conditions actually state that the audit should minimize business disruption. So this is something you can use to your benefit. And also when it comes to running audit scripts, that's a whole separate topic, but they're not mandatory in the end. So it's important to consider what data sources do you have internally versus, what would the outcome be if you would run audit scripts. And the non-disclosure agreements, many organizations, many legal teams and organizations find it important that when you share sensitive data to an external party, that you first have a signed NDA before you send, over any information to the auditor. So when you arrive at the data gathering phase, it's also very important then that all data is collected through a single contact person within your organization. So you want to avoid the auditor kind of going on a fishing expedition throughout your organization, asking questions to people everywhere, because then you don't have insight in what information has been shared. And also, it will make it more difficult for you to understand the audit report in the end. So assigning a single contact person will help you, be able to vet kind of all the questions being asked, and also, reduce the number of surprises in the end. And having a single contact person will also help you vet all the incoming questions and say, hey, why is the auditor asking this question? Usually it's to uncover potential non-compliance. So rather than just blindly, forwarding the technical details that your staff has given you, it's important to think about, am I, fully capturing the context? For example, am I considering non-production use? Am I considering cold standbys? Because it's good to give all that context to the auditor in one go, so that you don't have significant findings you have to push back against at the end. And that leads me to the reporting phase. So first, you'll always receive a draft report from the auditor before it goes to IBM. And it's very important that you take your time to carefully review this report and push back on any items you disagree with, not just on the license entitlements, so what you've purchased, but especially on the deployment side, so what's installed, because that part is where most of the incorrect findings are. And that's simply due to the limited set of information the auditor collects. They make certain assumptions, but those assumptions can be very much inaccurate. And it's very common. I've seen that if you push back on enough areas, that you can actually reduce the value of the technical shortfalls by 90%. That's not always the case, but it happens fairly often. So once you have that compliance report, once that's shared with IBM, and assuming there are still license shortfalls in there, it doesn't automatically mean you have to buy that amount of licenses from IBM. That might be IBM's initial proposal, but it's important to realize that even though you might be short a certain number of PVU licenses, for example, you can still propose to settle using a different metric. As long as it's the same product covering the same functionality, there might be lower cost alternatives you can use to cover your license shortfall. And then, the last two tips are probably the hardest to follow, because once the audit is done, everybody wants to move on with their lives and focus on other topics. But it's important that, if you have settled on something, but you have signed up to certain obligations, for example, fixing item T or cleaning up some installations, it's of course important to follow through on that, because otherwise you might get hit with a follow-up audit the next year. And the most valuable follow-up step, which is not commonly implemented, I would say, but it's actually very useful to capture all the audit steps you went through, because now you have experience with who provide information and what the audit procedures were. This is actually something you can build on moving forward with internal software asset management procedures for IBM. So yeah, that's definitely a important recommendation, but it's hard to kind of keep the focus after the audit is complete in many cases. So that's kind of a deep dive from start to finish on kind of the tips and tricks on dealing with an audit. I'll talk a little bit more about subcapacity licensing and why it's so important. So I mentioned it before. Essentially, when it comes to some of IBM's most common license metrics, they're licensed based on processor and server capacity. And specifically, the most common metric there is the processor value units, which expresses the power of your servers in a number of PVU point value. And IBM's default rule is that when you install a IBM product that is licensed based on PVUs, for example, you have to license the full capacity of the physical machine. So it doesn't matter if it's a virtual machine or logical partition, those installations have to be licensed to the full capacity of the machine, unless you meet the requirements for subcapacity licensing. Now, there's various requirements, but the most challenging requirement is installing the IBM license metric tool or an accepted alternative. There are not many of them. And this is the #1 compliance risk area at all customers. And just to give an example, on average, what we've calculated is that a customer for PVU-based products will have a compliance risk value of 2.5 times what they spend every year on those products if they meet the subcapacity requirements. But if they don't meet those requirements, the risk becomes 10 times as high. So if you would spend $1 million per year on certain PVU-based products, based on full capacity, you could easily have 25 million risk for those products. Could be higher or lower, it's an average, but it's in almost all cases, it's a very significant risk. So I'll talk briefly about ILMT and what to focus on. So #1, of course, if you have any processor-based metrics, so PVU is common, VPC is another one, or some RVU metrics, which are processor-based, also it's also applicable. It's very important that you have ILMT installed, but also that's operating correctly. So all the agents are connecting, and most importantly, that your reporting is configured correctly, because by default, ILMT reports are inaccurate. They make certain assumptions about what's installed, but you have to go through a software classification process to make sure that all the installations are reported correctly. So on the one hand, technically, you have to make sure it's working correctly, but also reporting wise, you have to make sure that the numbers reported by ILMT are accurate, because if that's not up to date, the technical risk is that you don't meet the subcapacity requirements. That's an issue in itself. But there's also a great risk that PVU quantities are over-reported. So without proper software classification and bundling, or not connecting to the VM managers, these are all reasons why ILMT might actually report much more PVUs than are actually deployed. So it's very important that you carefully review those reports before you provide them to an auditor. So that kind of covers my topic on ILMT.
Thank you so much, Koen. Really valuable information there. With that, we are concluding our series on IBM Audits. Thank you so much to Koen, thank you, Amir, and thanks to everybody who watched today. Please come back in the future for more software snack time snippets.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.